Okay.
Hi, Katie.
What triggered that? Do you think that was me signing in?
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Town and Gown. Always great to see some old faces, familiar faces rejoining this group. There'll be a few changes this year, which I'll make in a moment. But I just wanted to say a couple of words to those of you who are new to Town and Gown about the collaboration that supports this enterprise. So this is a collaboration among several groups. Age Alive, which is in the College of Osteopathic Medicine and is run by Dr. Claire Loz with support from a number of people who are on this call. Prime Time, the East Lansing Senior Centre, the Social Science Scholars Programme, which is an academic initiative at Michigan State University. Lovely to see some of my students who are joining this call. And also Great Decisions, which has been run out of People's Church here in East Lansing for some years. And of course, the People's Church. So some of us will always be joining these discussions at the Robertson Room at the People's Church. And I think there are probably, about 20 of us here tonight.
You had the high blood sugar of
Definitely.
blood sugar that's higher on the sardine fast.
If you'd like to join. And then I think that on some of these sessions over the next 6 months or so, a number of us will be going to have dinner afterwards to continue the discussion, but we'll alert you when that is happening. So we've got a really good lineup. We don't yet have a list of the coming speakers. We're desperately trying to get that together at the moment. And so Marna, who I'm working with here, and Sandy here, as well as a student intern, Stella, who's also on this.
Just thinking.
We'll have that for you the next. What do you think, Stella?
Yeah, we should probably.
It's a very good line.
Just a question. Then we can sell it, and we can finance our forever futures with it. What do you think?
I think that's a good plan.
Yeah, so yeah, do please mute. There we go. Okay, we're going to be switching to every other Tuesday. That way, I think the program becomes more sustainable. Because if we have a faculty member speaking every single Tuesday bar the summer, sooner or later we're going to run out of people to present. So we're going to switch to every other Tuesday. But you'll see that from the itinerary that we send out within the next week. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet and quickly introduce the student moderator for this session, Ryan Weinberg, who is a member of the Social Science Scholars Program, and we're very proud to have her in the program. She is a criminal justice and political science major who is very, very interested in foreign policy, international relations, but also intelligence work. So Ryan, thank you for being willing to do this, and I will hand it to you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Waller. My name is Ryan, and I'll be moderating this evening's Town and Gown. And I would like to introduce Dr. David Firestein, who is calling in from Austin, Texas this afternoon, I believe. Dr. Firestein is inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, also known as the Bush-China Foundation. Among the honors he has garnered during his diplomatic career include the Secretary of State's Award for Public Outreach in 2006 and the Linguist of the Year Award in 1997. Mr. Firestein is a co-author and author of 3 books on China, including 2 China-published Chinese language bestsellers. Mr. Firestein has also produced important Capitol Hill testimony, thought leadership, and scholarship on a wide range of topics, including U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and U.S. China trade. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and we're pleased and honored to hear from you. And if you guys have any questions, please send them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them. And at the end, when his presentation is over, I'll be sure to ask that for you.
Great. Ryan, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. John, thank you. Marna, thank you so much. And I don't know if he's on, but my dear friend Chuck Gliozzo, who introduced me to Marna, I want to thank him as well for establishing that connection. And it's wonderful to be with all of you virtually. I absolutely wish that I could be there in person with you, but of course, so many of us are on virtually. It's always a particular pleasure to be with people in person and to have that energy in the same room. But this is the next best thing, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity, in particular to Marna. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this, and I'm honored and delighted to be able to do it. The topic is certainly an interesting and resonant one. It's basically Taiwan and the U.S. China relationship. And the subtitle that I've given this talk is Harsh Realities and Inconvenient Truths. And I want to say a little bit about why I'm calling this talk that particular title, and lay out some of my thinking on this really important and timely and topical subject. I think all of us are aware, if we have been paying attention to the news, as I know this really wonderful group does, that Taiwan has been in the news and in the headlines a lot over the last couple of months, particularly with the visit of U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan about 7 weeks ago, and a number of things that have happened subsequent to that. And Taiwan's become a significant global story, and I think will continue to be one for some time to come. There's a lot of concern in the United States today that the world could see conflagration across the Taiwan Strait, not dissimilar in the view of some to what we're now seeing in terms of Russia and Ukraine. And so this is a topic that is on the minds of the top level people in Washington and around the world. President Biden himself has spoken explicitly about Taiwan a lot in recent days, including on 60 Minutes just this past Sunday evening. And Secretary Blinken actually was this past Sunday evening, President Biden the week before. So this is something that's a really timely issue. Why do I talk about the notion of harsh realities and inconvenient truths? The reason is because with respect to the particular issue of Taiwan, which you'll see this borne out as I start to delve into the topic matter, there is a set of very carefully constructed diplomatic formulations that are used by the United States and used by the mainland China, the People's Republic of China, that are used by Taiwan and others to talk about the issues around Taiwan. And it's almost as if it's a kind of catechism where, stating it from a US perspective, when you're talking about Taiwan, you have to almost say the same things in the same order with the same number of breaths, the same number of emphasis on the syllables and so on, that the policy is so technical and so carefully crafted that if you say literally one syllable out of sync with what's been said before, it draws attention and creates confusion, and that confusion can become potentially destabilizing. But what I also find is that that kind of language, these very carefully crafted formulations, sometimes obstruct and muddle the reality of what we really think in this country and what others think about the topic of the cross-strait relationship, the relationship between the mainland and Taiwan. And so what I want to do is peel back that veneer of diplomatic language and share with you in plain language from someone who is not speaking for any government, but rather just speaking for myself, and kind of give you a sense for what the real thinking is in the United States, in China, in Taiwan, and kind of get under the hood, if you will, of this issue and speak in real language about it so that we can understand it better. One of my arguments is that one of the reasons there is considerable friction around the issue of Taiwan in the context of the U.S. China relationship is because the United States and China don't generally speak honestly with each other when it comes to the topic of Taiwan, and for that matter, with respect to other topics. And so I think it's important that we peel those layers back and really speak honestly. And that's what I'll do. And hence the subtitle, Harsh Realities and Inconvenient Truths. So without further ado, let me just jump into the topic, and I'll keep an eye on the clock here so that we do have plenty of time for your questions and for discussion, which I really value and really appreciate in all of these sessions. Let me just lay out the basic sort of facts around the Taiwan issue in a very succinct way. From the mainland standpoint, Taiwan is unfinished business that goes back to the year 1949, when the Communist Party and its armed forces, quote, liberated, unquote, the mainland in 1949 under the leadership of Mao Zedong and took control of the mainland from the regime that had been in place just prior to that, which was the regime of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, or KMT. And on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen, and declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, October 1st, 1949. But the Communist parties and Mao Zedong's armed forces did not have the capability at that time to go across the strait and cross those 90 plus miles and extend its dominion and sovereignty over the island of Taiwan, which is the island to which the KMT forces fled in the middle of 1949, just prior to the establishment on the mainland of the People's Republic. And so starting from October 1st, 1949, you essentially had this highly unusual, I would say sui generis situation globally, in which you had two regimes both claiming sovereignty over the same piece of territory, namely China. One was the People's Republic of China, which in fact controlled the mainland, and the other was the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek at that time, which did in fact control Taiwan, but did not control the mainland, nor did the mainland control Taiwan. And these two places kind of developed in parallel ways over the next several decades. But from China's standpoint, the notion that Taiwan is separately governed, de facto governed independently of the mainland, is a serious problem, and one that needs to be solved and must be solved from their standpoint. And it's the unfinished business of 1949. And from China's standpoint, Taiwan must become, as it would put it, reunified with the mainland. Now, from Taiwan's perspective, they view things very, very differently. Taiwan has evolved over these past decades, and it's a self-governing island of a population of about 24 million people. It flies its own flag, has its own government, has its own military, has its own currency, has its own land, has its own people. And de facto, by any normal definition of what constitutes a state or nation, it would be regarded as a state among states, a nation among nations in the world. But because of this odd history, you still have juridically this situation in which the leadership of the mainland claims all of China, including Taiwan, and the leadership of Taiwan claims all of China, including the mainland. And they obviously fundamentally disagree as to who the legitimate government is. So the bottom line is that you have fundamentally diverging perspectives on what the definition of China, quote unquote, is. What is China? And who is the proper, rightful, lawful government of, quote, China? That's the basic backdrop. Now, with that being said, the United States is deeply involved in this issue for a number of reasons, including historical reasons. When the United States and the People's Republic of China normalized diplomatic relations, a process that started playing out in the 1970s, when Richard Nixon went to China on that famous visit in 1972, exactly 50 years ago this year. The anniversary was in February. One of the fundamental issues that needed to be resolved was the issue of Taiwan. And the United States and China worked through some language and language that was reflected in what became known as the three communiques, basically joint statements that were issued in 1972, 1979, and 1982. And to summarize the basic essence of it, the United States, as a part of its process of normalizing diplomatic relations with China, and when I say China, I now mean the mainland or the People's Republic of China, as part of that process, the United States basically said, we recognize the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China, period. That's basically an exact quote. And that has been the policy of the United States since 1979. On January 1st, 1979, we, the United States, extended formal diplomatic recognition to China and terminated formal diplomatic recognition to the Republic of China, otherwise known as Taiwan, we literally terminated our embassy's operations, terminated consulates, terminated diplomatic staff, removed the ambassador, and all of those accoutrements of diplomatic recognition transferred over to the mainland. And so as we did that, we developed an approach to China, an approach rather to Taiwan, that is generally referred to as the One China policy, the One China policy of the United States. And basically that policy, which you need to understand in order to understand what's about to come, which is the harsh realities and the inconvenient truths, the policy can be summarized pretty simply. Number one, that the United States, as I noted, recognizes that that China, the government of the People's Republic of China, is the sole legal government of China. That's why we have our embassy, our consulates, our ambassador, and our diplomatic corps in the mainland. That's where I used to serve when I was a U.S. diplomat. I served at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, among other places. So we have that. We also have the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a law that was passed by Congress and signed by the president. It entered into force in 1979, and it compels the United States to provide defensive articles and services to Taiwan so as to help Taiwan maintain a self-defense capacity relative to an unnamed in the legislation threat. Of course, that threat is presumed to be China, but China is not specified in that way. But this legislation, the Taiwan Relations Act, or TRA, has the force of law and governs U.S. actions with respect to making available to Taiwan arms, defense arms and services to the island of Taiwan so as to maintain its self-defense. Meanwhile, we have the three communiques of 1972, 79, and 82 that talk a lot about Taiwan and talk about how the United States can and can't, or is permitted and not permitted to engage with Taiwan. Again, there's things you can do when you have formal diplomatic recognition that you cannot do when you don't have formal diplomatic recognition. And at the same time, there's something called the 6 assurances, which are assurances that the United States made to Taiwan. If the 3 communiques made commitments of some sort, at least political commitments, not necessarily legally binding, but political commitments to the mainland, we also made some political commitments to Taiwan. Those are known as the 6 assurances. And those assurances basically say to Taiwan in the US voice, we're not going to sell you down the river. We're not going to negotiate your fate. We're not going to try to do some sort of a double deal with the mainland. We're not going to pressure you into doing anything you don't want, and so on. And finally, there is the question of what's often referred to as, or the policy of what's referred to as strategic ambiguity, which basically says that if the mainland were to attack Taiwan or invade Taiwan, we, the United States, as a matter of conscious policy, are ambiguous, strategically ambiguous as to what we would do in response, which is to say that our official policy, and I mean this not facetiously, but quite literally, is we don't know what we would do if China were to invade Taiwan. And we're not, and if we did know, which we don't, we wouldn't advertise it because we want to be ambiguous and we want to make China guess. And we want that ambiguity to be a deterrent to any Chinese effort potentially in the future to change the status quo unilaterally. So let me summarize this, and then I'll go into these bullet points that I want to share about the inconvenient, the harsh realities and inconvenient truths. If one were stating U.S. policy in one fell swoop, we would say that U.S. policy is based in the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 communiques as modified by modified by the 6 assurances to Taiwan, and within the constraints of something we refer to as a strategic ambiguity when it comes to the issue of what we would do in a hypothetical scenario. That is the catechism. That's what we have to say. In addition to that, we say that we don't want either side to change the status quo unilaterally. We don't want anyone forced into doing something they don't want to do. We don't want anyone coerced into doing something they don't want to do. We don't want anyone unilaterally changing things. And we want the final peaceful resolution of the cross-strait question to be something that accords with the will of people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. So that is our policy. That's a lot. That's a lot to have to sort of remember and memorize. And it's one of the reasons that presidents of both parties in our country, the United States, often misstate US policy because there are so many technical things that have to be said in a certain order, quite literally in a certain order, that it's almost impossible for a lay person who is not deeply steeped in all of this to get all the words right. And if you change one word, it changes the meaning of the policy and sends signals that you may not be intending to send and creates confusion. Okay, now with that backdrop, let me say a little bit about kind of the heart of this presentation, and I'll continue to look at the clock to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions. If we're being honest, there are some things that we can say about the U.S. One China policy and about the overall cross-strait situation that are that need to be said, but that are never said by officials. So let me reiterate, everything I'm saying, I'm saying on my own behalf. I don't speak for anyone else. I don't speak for any government. And a lot of the things that I say are things that the two governments would disagree with publicly, whether or not they agreed with them privately. But I then have the ability to say to you what I really think and to be honest and to put some real information on the table in a way that government officials often cannot do. So with that said, my first point is, and this is the first harsh reality or inconvenient truth, is that the U.S. One China policy and the U.S. overall approach to China is a case in which our declared policy as a nation, in my judgment, does not accurately reflect the actual strategic sentiment of the United States. Meaning we say that we think one thing, but in reality, in my opinion, I think we think something else. So there is a divergence between what we say we believe in and what we actually believe in. And China has picked up on that. And I think China is not wrong when it observes, hey, America, what you're saying is different than what you're doing. And I think China is actually correct in that assessment. What do I mean by this? According to US policy, for example, and this is probably the key point, the United States would be happy with any outcome to which Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, that is in the mainland and in Taiwan, would agree. So as long as both sides agree, we have said as a matter of declared policy in writing and repeated many times that we would be fine with that. That is to say, we're neutral. We're neutral as to the ultimate outcome of the issue of Taiwan. Whether Taiwan reunifies or doesn't reunify, we say that we're neutral. We say that as long as people on both sides accept it, it's fine with us. The reality is we're not neutral. The reality is we're absolutely against reunification, period. There's no question about it in my mind. We never say that. No government official in this country will say that. But that is, in my very considered judgment, the reality of where we are. Think about how negative the sentiment in this country is toward China right now. Can you imagine that the United States would be okay with a scenario in which Taiwan, democratic Taiwan, were somehow reunified with the mainland? Bear in mind, the mainland is the #2 largest economy in the world. Taiwan is, despite its tiny size, the number 18 economy on the planet Earth. And it's a place that is smaller in terms of population than Texas, and it's a top 20, top 10% economy. So the notion that we would really be okay with that, if both sides hypothetically were okay with it, it's not true. The truth is, a really good one-sentence description of US policy toward Taiwan, in my opinion, okay, but it's a pretty well-informed opinion, is we will do everything we possibly can within the constraints of maintaining formal diplomatic recognition with China and not having formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. Within those constraints, we are going to do everything we can in our human power to make reunification as unlikely as it can possibly be. That is what we do. That's what we do every single day. And in my opinion, the Chinese are not wrong when they point that out. Now we say, well, no, our policy is the same. It's never changed, etc. We're neutral. We're not neutral. And think about this important point here. When any of us tell something to someone else that we know is untrue and they know is untrue, what do you think that does to trust? It's corrosive of trust. It means that the next 10 things that you say are going to hold little credibility in the ears of the beholder, because what you're saying to them is something that they can see with their own eyes is simply untrue, and you know it. And yet we say these things, and for its part, China says things to us that are also untrue, self-evidently. And so this corrodes the trust, the very limited amount of trust that there is in the relationship. So that's the first point, is that we really don't mean what we say, in my opinion. The second point is, and this is something that I think my Chinese friends in the mainland have not fully understood, and that is that they think the U.S. One China policy is binding upon the United States. And what I've had to share with my friends in China is it's not. It's not binding on the United States. It's only binding to the degree that the United States is willing to be bound by it. This is not a law. The One China policy, our general approach to Taiwan, except for the Taiwan Relations Act, which is the only part of the policy that is law. None of the rest of it is law. None of the rest of it was passed by the Congress or signed by the president. None of the rest of it is a Senate confirmed treaty that has the force of law in terms of American jurisprudence. None of this is binding. We are the author of our own One China policy. The One China policy is for the United States, not China, to understand, interpret, and execute as we see fit. And any president can and others as well, can fundamentally change the interpretation, change how we understand the policy, change how we interpret it, and change how we execute it. And we've done that. And so I think it has come as a rude awakening to many in China that the United States is in fact not bound by the One China policy. It doesn't regard the executive branch, which has the constitutional prerogative to conduct U.S. foreign policy, again, pursuant to the terms of the Constitution, and has the lead on foreign policy. The executive branch itself is not bound and does not feel bound by its own policy. That's why the policy has changed a lot and shifted a lot over recent years in particular. I could give many examples of that, but the fundamental point is, the Chinese think of it as binding, and they often say to the United States, you are violating your own One China policy. And what I say to my friends in China is, you can think that, but the only view that matters as to whether we're violating our own policy is ours, by definition, just the same way that China has the exclusive prerogative to judge whether it is acting in accordance with its own policies. So that's something that I think has been a bit of a shock. The one thing that has the force of law is the Taiwan Relations Act, or TRA, of 1979. That compels us to do certain things. Everything else is negotiable. And it changes, and it's a moving target. And that leads me to the third inconvenient truth about our One China policy. And that is, the Chinese may have thought or may think still that it binds, and again, I think erroneously, they may think that it binds the executive branch. But whether or not they think that, here's another inconvenient truth or harsh reality from a Chinese perspective. The One China policy does not bind Congress. It is an executive branch policy. It is a policy established by the executive branch. It does not necessarily extend to the United States Congress, which of course, pursuant to our Constitution, is a co-equal branch of government that is not second fiddle as a branch to the executive. In fact, it appears before the executive branch in the Constitution in Article 1. So, the Congress is going to and the congressional leadership is going to do what it sees fit and what the leaders see fit to do, whether or not that accords with anyone's definition, including the sitting US president's definition of the one China policy. And hence, the US Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, made the decision ultimately to go to China. There was precedent for it. Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich in 1997 visited Taiwan, and it created an uproar at the time. Speaker of the House Pelosi decided to visit Taiwan in early August and did so. It was certainly her prerogative. There's no law barring any member of Congress from visiting Taiwan, or for that matter, any American. And again, that which no law forbids is something that can be done. And so the speaker, exercising her prerogative, made the decision to visit. Whether or not President Biden thought that was a good idea, liked it, didn't like it, it didn't matter. The fact is, whereas the US president presumably under the one China policy could not visit Taiwan, the Speaker of the House clearly can, and she did. And it created an uproar, and we can talk more about that as we go through it. But the point that I make is that the one China policy binds neither the executive branch nor the congressional nor the legislative branch of our government. And this is why things happen, particularly in recent years, relative to US actions pertaining to Taiwan, that shock Chinese, because in their very different political system, which is unitary, the notion that a legislative leader would travel somewhere that Xi Jinping doesn't want that legislative leader to travel is obviously incomprehensible. It's not something that could possibly happen. But in our system, it can and does happen. So those are the three inconvenient truths around our one China policy, that it doesn't reflect our actual thinking. It's not binding on the executive, and it's not binding on our legislature. Now, let me say a few words about a couple of other harsh realities that I think need to be spoken about plainly if we're to really understand the dynamics of this situation. The fourth point, having made three thus far, the fourth point I would make is about Taiwan's sentiment toward the idea of, quote, reunification, or as the folks in Taiwan might put it, unification. There's even a dispute over the term, because China, mainland China, uses the term reunification, but of course, the People's Republic of China has never exercised control over Taiwan in its history, because it didn't have the capacity to cross the Taiwan Strait in 1949. So a lot of people take issue with the notion of the word reunification. Nevertheless, we're talking about the idea of bringing it back into the fold. Well, Taiwan's sentiment on this question of whether to come back in the fold is very clear. No one in Taiwan wants to be unified or reunified with China, period. It's as simple as that. The polls make very clear, and the most recent authoritative polling information that I've seen from Taiwan, and it tracks with everything I've seen over a 30-year period of observing this data and studying this data very closely, about 1% of people in Taiwan would be theoretically in favor of, quote, unifying or reunifying with China in some foreseeable period. And if you extend it out over a longer period or define it more amorphously, maybe 5% of the people of Taiwan could get their mind around some type of closer relationship with the mainland. But 95 to 99% of the people in Taiwan want absolutely nothing to do with it. They just don't want it for many different reasons. And so one of the things that China has to grapple with is the logical extension of that point, which is that if there is no sentiment in Taiwan that favors unification, then the only way that China is going to be able to reunify Taiwan, or bring Taiwan back into the fold, if you will, is through the use of force. And here, let me note that China's stated position is that China wants to see, quote, peaceful reunification. That's the term they use. We, the United States, by contrast, use the term peaceful resolution. You can see the difference there. But China says peaceful reunification is what we want. But if Taiwan doesn't reunify peacefully, we reserve the right to use force to force it to do so under force of arms. That's the Chinese position. And they don't take force off the table as a last resort, if you will, to force the issue. Well, the truth is, Taiwan is never going to reunify with China voluntarily, period. It's just never going to happen, ever, under any circumstances. And there's a lot of ways that one could explain that. But the easiest way to explain it is that people that have the kind of freedoms that exist in Taiwan today never give those freedoms up voluntarily. It's just there is no precedent for it in the world. It just doesn't happen. And it's not going to happen. So what China is left with is a harsh realization that it is going to have to rely on its last resort, its self-stated last resort, the use of force in order to achieve its vision for reunification. And that's an uncomfortable truth, I think, that China has to come to terms with. And the notion that somehow China will win over the hearts and minds of people in Taiwan is a fallacy, and it's not something that's going to happen. That leads to my next point. It's what I call the principal conundrum of the People's Republic of China, or the mainland, and that is that China faces a dilemma, and it's an unresolvable dilemma, and that is this: by not taking force off the table, China is, by definition, alienating the very people whose hearts and minds it hopes to win by simply saying, if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to come after you and invade the island. And obviously, when you say that, as a matter of declared policy, reiterated many times over many decades, then you're not going to win a lot of points, public opinion points in the public that you say that you are prepared to invade. But if China were to take the use of force off the table, in my judgment, Taiwan would go independent tomorrow, if not today. So the use of force is the only thing that's keeping Taiwan from going independent. But the threat of the use of force is exactly what is alienating the people of Taiwan from any notion that they want to join with the mainland. That is a Gordian knot that cannot ever be undone. And there is no solution to it unless you start relaxing constraints. But the mainland is not going to relax its constraint. It is going to continue to want Taiwan to come back into the fold. It will never relax that constraint as long as this country, the PRC, exists in its current form. And so it's stuck. And it has to rely on a threat that makes it impossible for it to achieve its goal peacefully. So that's a China side conundrum that I would also call a harsh reality for the Chinese, certainly a bitter reality for them. Now, let me talk about a harsh reality for the United States. The fact is, as I've made mention of, the United States, under our law, has an obligation, regards ourselves as having a legal obligation, legal mandate to provide defense arms and services to Taiwan so as to provide for Taiwan's self-defense. But here's the conundrum for the United States. We're never going to be able to provide enough arms realistically to arm Taiwan out of its inferior security position relative to the mainland. We're just not going to be able to do it. Since 1979, on average, we have made available onto the shores of Taiwan approximately a little over $1 billion worth of military hardware every year, on average, 1.1, 1.2 billion every year. It's ticked up a little bit in recent years to something more like 1.5 billion. But over the years, it's been a little north of $1 billion a year in arms on average delivered to the shores of Taiwan. And so what we're seeing is an arithmetic growth of Taiwan's defense capabilities. But what you see on the other side of the strait is a geometric growth in the capabilities of the mainland. And an arithmetic trajectory can, by definition, never catch up with a geometric trajectory. We are not going to be able to provide enough arms. Even the most hawkish hawks in America, who hate China and who want to do anything in their human power to gum up the works for China and hold China back and so on and so forth, even they aren't willing to spend the money that it would take to give Taiwan anything like the arms that Taiwan would need to start getting anywhere near the notion of military parity relative to the mainland. It's just not going to happen. No one's even proposed it. So the bottom line is, we sell arms to Taiwan. By the way, I'm glad that we do. I've been for it for my entire career, and including as a private citizen, and I'm on the record for that. But let's also recognize that we will never arm Taiwan out of its security dilemma. We don't have the ability or the will as a nation to do so. And so there will be a permanent asymmetry to the capabilities across the strait. Now, this brings me to the last couple of points I want to make as I keep an eye on the clock. And that is really the last hard truth, if you will, that I want to share is, what is the fundamental problem in the cross-strait picture? What is the fundamental problem? From the Chinese often like to point out or note or observe that the U.S. is the problem, that if it weren't for you meddling Americans, stated from their perspective, that this problem would have been solved a long time ago. You Americans are meddling in our affairs. You're providing arms to Taiwan. You're gumming up the works. You're trying to stop us from reunifying. And if it weren't for you, we would have licked this problem a long time ago. That's what China thinks. That's what a lot of people will very genuinely and authentically say that they believe. But what I often say to my Chinese friends is, you're wrong. The fundamental issue in the cross-strait problem is not the United States. The United States involvement is a symptom of the problem, but it's not the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the existential incompatibility of the two political, social, and economic systems. That is those of the mainland and Taiwan. The way I often put it is, if you look at Article 1 of China's constitution, the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, Article 1, Sentence 1 states that China's regime type is a dictatorship. It actually says that. It says it in Chinese and in China's official English. I'm not using the word myself. I'm quoting the Chinese Constitution. China refers to itself as a, quote, people's democratic dictatorship, but the noun is dictatorship. Taiwan, in Article 1 of its constitution, the constitution of what it would refer to as the Republic of China, says that Taiwan is a republican democracy of, by, and for the people. Some of those words sound familiar. They used both republican and democracy in there, I think not accidentally, and they used of, by, and for the people as a tip of the hat to Abraham Lincoln. But that's what's in the ROC Constitution. So the point that I often make to people in both places is, China's system would be unconstitutional in Taiwan, and Taiwan's system would be unconstitutional in the mainland. There is an existential and unresolvable irreconcilability between the two systems. And you could say it in a lot of other ways, but the two systems are fundamentally, politically very different, socially very different. And that is the problem. That is why people in Taiwan don't want anything to do with the notion of reunifying with the mainland. China, for its part, has put forward the idea of, quote, one country, two systems, saying, let's all be one country, let's fly our flag over your island, etc., but you can keep your system. But the people in Taiwan just don't buy it. They don't believe it. They don't believe in it. They don't think it's credible. They don't think it would happen that way. They look at what's happened in Hong Kong, and they conclude that China would not be reliable in terms of keeping its promises. These are the judgments they're making. As I said on Capitol Hill in 2014, if the people of Taiwan wanted one country, two systems, they would already have it. They obviously don't want it. So, the fundamental issue is the irreconcilability, the incompatibility of the two systems. And as long as that incompatibility exists, this issue will never be resolved. And and the U.S. involvement in the issue is a function of that incompatibility, not the other way around. let me conclude by just sharing a few final thoughts about China's calculus about the Taiwan issue. And by the way, I am actually condensing this a little bit because I do want to leave time for your questions and comments. But let me condense to the main points here. I think that every day that the leadership of China wakes up and does not invade Taiwan is a day, by definition, again, in my assessment, that it believes that the costs of invading Taiwan outweigh the benefits. And therefore, that's why they don't do it. So every day they wake up on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, et cetera, and they don't go into Taiwan. It's a day that they think that going into Taiwan would, the costs would outweigh the benefits of doing so. If China were ever to wake up and judge the opposite, that on that day, somehow their thinking changed or circumstances changed, and the benefits were deemed to outweigh the costs, then they would do it. But here's my take. I think that China's assessment is correct. I think the costs would outweigh the benefits from their own perspective. I'm not talking about from my perspective or the US perspective. From China's own perspective, I think their assessment is correct. And I think that equation in which the costs outweigh the benefits is going to be true for a very, very long time to come. That is why I do not foresee a scenario in which the mainland, in which the China goes into Taiwan via force of arms. I don't think that's going to happen anytime in the near future, in the foreseeable future, because I don't think that there will come a time in the foreseeable future in which that calculus changes. Some people ask, a lot of people ask in terms of the discourse on this topic, does Russia's invasion, by the way, unlawful, horrible, unjustified, unprovoked, and deplorable invasion of Ukraine, does that somehow change China's calculus or make it more likely that China might do the same thing relative to Taiwan? My answer to that is no. Because again, I don't think it changes what the costs are for China. If anything, it shows that there will be very significant costs, the same kinds of costs that Russia has borne in terms of sanctions, in terms of economic isolation, in terms of becoming basically a pariah state in the world, and the list goes on. And for that matter, Russia's now basically losing the war because many other countries have come together to help arm Ukraine and so on and so forth. And so I think that if anything, what's happened in Ukraine probably suggests to Xi Jinping and the leadership of China, it would not be a good idea to go into Taiwan, even though it may not necessarily result in a direct US military response. I will just note parenthetically, this could be the topic of an hour-long discussion by itself, but interestingly enough, President Biden, not this past Sunday, but the previous Sunday, stated on national television on 60 Minutes that if China were to invade Taiwan, that he as commander-in-chief would take the United States into war with China. He said that. He would literally deploy US troops to defend Taiwan, and a state of war would exist de facto between the United States and China. He said that on 60 Minutes. It was a shocking departure from all previous established US policy, but it's also not the first time he's said that. So it's becoming less and less plausible that this is a misstatement. We can talk about that as a sidebar later. But as a matter of declared policy, the United States has not said what we would do. And if I may editorialize, it sounds presumptuous, but I'll say it anyway. I don't think that President Biden is accurately articulating the actual US position on the issue. But again, who am I to say? He's the president of the United States. It's his prerogative. But I am skeptical that he means what he clearly said. He said it clearly. I don't know that he means it, and his advisors have tried to walk it back. But anyway, there's an interesting question mark around all that. The bottom line is, I don't think we are going to see conflagration across the Taiwan Strait anytime soon. But the way that we maximize chances of maintaining peace and stability and minimize chances of miscalculation is by communicating, that is to say, the United States and China, for example, communicating with each other more openly, more honestly, more candidly, more directly, maybe less diplomatically, and saying what we actually think to each other so that we know where we stand. I think there is a lot of kabuki dancing that is occurring where we say this, they say that, we say this, they say that, and it's the same carefully scripted or choreographed kabuki dance. The reality is we need to start being more honest because a lot depends on our accurate understanding of the other side and vice versa. And I hope that some of the analysis that I provided helps take us in that direction. With that, I want to thank Marna and all of you once again, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I think Ryan now has the floor to moderate, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I have a few questions for you already. So first most, if the US policy is not bounded by the one China policy and China is catching on to this, why does the US still feel a need to follow through with it?
That's a really excellent question. It's an excellent question. And Ryan, thank you also for moderating. I think the reason that the United States still holds on to this language is because the current, here's how I would say it. The current US approach to the issue of Taiwan as an issue in U.S. China relations is the absolute worst possible approach that you can imagine, except for every other conceivable approach. So it's sort of like what Winston Churchill said about democracy. It's the worst thing in the world except for every other possible way of governing. And that's what we have. It's kabuki-like, it's formulaic, it's always the same lines. We're not telling the truth to each other. But in some ways, deviating from that creates the possibility, a greater possibility of instability, miscalculation, and potentially conflagration. And so we hold on to it because it is the least worst way of framing our policy. It's known, it has generated a certain stability, it may be a precarious stability, but a stability that has obtained since 1979. We have not seen a conflagration across the Taiwan Strait. Yes, you see missile tests and so forth, but you don't see warfare. And so the argument for the set of policies, Ryan, to the question that was asked is, it seems to work, so let's stick with it. And let's not do anything to topple the apple cart or put into disequilibrium this very careful balance we have between the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 communiques, the 6 assurances, the one China policy, the strategic ambiguity, and so on. And therefore, let's not rock the boat. Let's keep these policies in place. However, I think you can keep the policies in place, but be more honest intellectually about how the policies have changed and how we have and why we, for example, the United States, have made the decision to understand, interpret, and execute our self-declared policies differently than we did 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 years ago. Instead of gaslighting the other side and saying nothing's changed, everyone knows that's factually not true. When we gaslight the other side, just as when they gaslight us and say things to us that we know are absolutely untrue, it corrodes trust and creates the potential for instability. But this is why I think we stick to it, because it's worked for a long time. And there may not, as clumsy as this overall formulation is, if we stick with it and adhere to it, it seems to be a recipe for maintaining the status quo, which is the least worst scenario that we could possibly have.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on because we have quite a few questions. So David asked a few questions, but I'm going to pick 1 or 2 out. What is China learning from the Ukraine invasion? And how does China see itself in the world economy?
Yeah, those are great questions. They're two very different questions. Let me say a little bit about each one. Here's what I think China has learned, in my opinion, from the Ukraine situation. Number one, that if China were to do something relative to Taiwan, analogous to what Russia has done in terms of Ukraine, and obviously there are some differences because Russia regarded Ukraine as a sovereign state up until the time that it didn't. But China has never regarded Taiwan as a sovereign state. So one can point out that there are very significant distinctions, not least the fact that 90 miles of sea separates the mainland and Taiwan, and that's a different ballgame militarily than going into a country where all you have to do is drive the speed limit on a flat highway. That's all Russia had to do with Ukraine. It's a whole different ballgame when you have to do an amphibious landing on a mountainous island. Leaving all that aside, here's the two things China learned. If they go into Taiwan, there will be serious consequences that will change China's way of life forever. Mostly in terms of economic isolation, economic punishments, sanctions, basically cutting China off from a vast swath of the world market to a very large degree. I think that probably would happen. Let me give you one piece of data. China trades with Russia at the level of $150 billion a year in two-way trade every year, 150 billion. With the United States and the European Union, it's 1.5 trillion. That's 10x. Russia could go into Ukraine, and it relates to the second question, precisely because one thing is true about Russia that's not true about China. Russia is in some ways irrelevant to the global economy. It is a big economy, but it is also a one-trick pony that basically focuses only on energy and does almost nothing else for the global consumer economy or services economy or anything else. It has a lot of minerals and a lot of oil and gas, natural gas, and that's it. But China actually matters. Because China matters as the number 2 economy in the world, it is in a position to be damaged vastly more seriously by economic isolation than Russia was. Russia could go into Ukraine because Russia doesn't matter. China matters. That's going to be a constraint on China's ability to go into Taiwan. But that's the first thing. The second thing that China learned, however, is this. The United States, and I'm saying this the way I think that China internalized it and perceived it. I think China comes away from the Ukraine situation and says, here's what we also know. The United States will not fight a hot war directly with a nuclear weapons state that has intercontinental capability and has the ability to obliterate scores and scores of American cities with nuclear weapons that we cannot defend against, period. That's why we are not fighting Russia in Ukraine in a direct military sense. In fact, that's what President Biden said on day one. He said, we are not going to fight Russia over this issue. We will do a lot of other things. We'll punish Russia, we'll sanction Russia, we'll isolate Russia, we'll give arms and support to Ukraine and so forth. But we are not going to send a single American troop to go over there and die on the front lines. And I think what China has come away with is we're not going to do that for China either. As a parenthetical point, I'll come to the economic question briefly here in a second, but as a really interesting and profound parenthetical point, if I were the 60 Minutes journalist, I think it was Chris Wallace, if Joe Biden, President Biden, the sitting president, sat in front of me 6 feet away and said, I'm answering clearly, I will send U.S. troops to fight China if they go into Taiwan, my next question would have been, Mr. President, why the distinction between Ukraine and China, given that China has many hundreds of intercontinental nuclear weapons and delivery systems that could lay waste to our nation and make the rubble bounce here just as it would anywhere else? Why would you make a distinction? What is the basis for the distinction, Mr. President, that you're drawing between a nuclear-armed Russia and a nuclear-armed China? And I don't think he would have had an answer to that question, but I would have liked the question to be asked. But what is the distinction? That's an interesting thing for all of us to think about. So those are the things that I think China took away from Ukraine. The last thing on the economics, China is the number 2 economy in the world by gross domestic product volume. It will soon be number 1 in a matter of a few years. It'll overtake us. Obviously, it's far behind the United States in terms of per capita because China's population is much larger, but it is growing. It wants to keep growing. And it wants to, I think, continue to be a part of the global economy and to play a greater and greater role in the global economy, to be a technology superpower, to be an innovation superpower, to go toe to toe with the United States, and to be connected to consumer markets all across the world so that it can prosper, and candidly, so that the Communist Party can maintain its permanent monopoly on power, which ultimately is the first principle of Chinese governance. So that's how China sees itself. That's what China wants. And that's why I think China would be much more careful and pragmatic than Russia has been under Putin, when considering the kind of consequences and fallout from a potential military scenario across the strait. To put it differently, I think Xi Jinping is a far more rational actor than Vladimir Putin is. And he's not going to take the same kind of risks or do the same kinds of things to hurt his country that Vladimir Putin has clearly done to the detriment of Russia's national security interests.
Great. I have a question from Joseph. What are the roadblocks stopping mainland China from accepting Taiwan as its own independent state, given their incompatibility? Is it simply the history between the two, or is there something more?
Yeah, it's a really great question, really great question. And simply put, it is the history. The Chinese, there's a few things to point out. One, the overwhelming majority of people in the mainland are ethnically Han, which is to say they're Chinese, quote unquote, ethnically. And there are also ethnic minorities, 54, 55 other ethnic minorities, but China is mostly a homogenous Chinese society in an ethno-cultural sense. And Taiwan is as well. And there is a mindset, both in the mainland and historically, even in Taiwan, that there is but one China. And both the mainland and Taiwan are part of that China. And historically, both the mainland and Taiwan actually agreed on that. What they disagreed on was which government is the legitimate government that should represent that one China. But both sides have agreed there's one China, and Taiwan should be regarded as a part of it. Even Taiwan has historically said that. Even Taiwan juridically, or the Republic of China juridically, believes that the mainland still belongs to the Republic of China. So neither side is keen to split up the two. And that goes back to history. It goes to kind of the ethnic, Han Chinese makeup of both places, with those being the great majority, Han Chinese being the great majority, the historical ties, and so forth and so on. At the same time, psychically, the mainland dealt with a lot of pain in its history in terms of dealing with the West from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, the so-called century of humiliation, where China was carved up by European powers and to a certain degree the United States and others, and Japan and others. And the notion of being carved up, being separated, being torn apart is something that at a deep psychological level, and a lot of diplomacy and a lot of national affairs is about psychology. I've often said you can learn more about diplomacy through the writings of Freud than you can through the writings of Clausewitz. And there is something in the Chinese psyche that does not accept the notion that this unwholeness is that can be accepted. It doesn't sit well with certainly the Chinese leadership and with some segment of the Chinese people. And the notion of closing out unfinished business from history and making China whole again and so forth is something that is a significant factor in all this. The other last point I would make to the question, again, a very good question, is that from a political standpoint, I think the mainland leadership, the Communist Party leadership on the mainland, believes that if they were to lose Taiwan or preside over the loss of Taiwan, the permanent independence of Taiwan, that in other words, Taiwan floats away forever from China, that would be their death knell, that would signify the end of their legitimacy, that it would be a blow to the legitimacy of Communist Party rule. They've placed a major stake and bet, if you will, on, I say they, the Communist Party, on its ability to reunify the country over some period of time. If they fail, the leadership, I think, believes it would be a major blow to their ability to continue to govern the mainland. And so, if you will, from a self-serving standpoint and a political standpoint, this is a very serious issue as well. All of those are the reasons why the mainland simply cannot let this go. Whether they should or shouldn't is a debatable question in some quarters. It's not, certainly in the Chinese leadership, but they can't let it go. They just can't see past it. In Taiwan now, this is the last thing I'll say on this, the mindset is different. The mindset is, hey, we get it. We ain't never gonna govern the mainland. We got that. Okay. Even whatever we say juridically, whatever we claim juridically, that the reality is that's lost. We're over it. And so now let's talk about the future of Taiwan. That's kind of where sentiment is in Taiwan. That is not where the mainland is, for the reasons that I've described.
Thank you. All right, and a question from Joe. Do you believe that the world economies could or would try to isolate China economically from their own supply chains? Joe believes they're past that possibility.
It's a very good question, once again, and let me say, amazing question. Thank you all so much for these great questions. I think we are not yet across the Rubicon, or we've not yet passed the tipping point on the notion of getting China out of our supply chains. There are certainly voices in this country that say, let's get China out of our supply chains, even if it means we pay more for product A, product B, product C. And by the way, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of products. And there are people that say that, but that's not where we are right now. We still do $650 billion worth of two-way trade between the United States and China, better part of 700 billion. So it's theoretical, but it's not real. However, to the question, if China really were to go into Taiwan and really literally invade Taiwan militarily, in my opinion, in my considered judgment, the United States, directly contrary to what President Biden said on 60 Minutes and what he said before, in my opinion, the United States would not go into war, would not fight a war with China in a direct sense. Again, what I'm saying is exactly the opposite of what President Biden said. You can choose who to believe, and obviously the president has great credibility and obviously constitutional authority. I don't think he's right when he says what he says. I don't think that's what would happen. But that would be the impetus to get the United States public and the publics of Europe and all the economies that matter in the world to say, we're not going to fight a war. We're not going to begin the bombing in 5 minutes and send nuclear weapons into China and so on and so forth. But this is the moment where we say, we are shutting you out. You, China, are going to become a pariah in this world. You are not going to trade with the U.S. You're not going to trade with Europe. You're not going. We're going to wipe you out economically. We're going to do everything we can to create such negative economic circumstances in your country that the people of China overthrow your regime. I mean, that's the essence of where I think the mindset in our country would be. And, I think it would be, this is the one thing that could happen that could push the US and Europe and the rest of the world that matters economically, that matters the most, over the edge and say, this is where we draw the line. We're not going to fight World War III, but we are going to fight an economic World War III. And you, China, have just lost your privileges in this country and in every other country that matters economically. And that said, China is a big country and it's much more diverse and much more capable as an economy than Russia. And it would have to go it alone, but it'd have to work with the likes of North Korea, Russia, Belarus, and a few other handful of countries that, are on that side of things, but it would lose 140, 150 major economies pretty much overnight. And yes, that would be the straw that, to mix metaphors, it breaks the camel's back and gets us away from China as a part of our supply chains. Let me just say, I and the Bush China Foundation, I'm pro-business, pro-trade, pro-globalization, pro-U.S. China trade, and I think it's good for America to trade with China. I'm glad we're doing it now. We ought to get rid of the job-killing, consumer gouging tariffs, imbecilic tariffs that have hurt us far more than they've hurt China, the ones that Trump put in place, but that Biden still keeps in place. They're horrible for our country, and it's really a stupid policy that's bad for us. However, if China does this, then that is a whole different ballgame, and then the sentiment in this country is going to be in a very different place. But that's not where we are right now.
Thanks. So we have time for a few more questions from Dr. Waller. Invading Taiwan might be unwise for China at present, but of course, wars can begin and escalate even when there is a high probability of losses outweighing gains. Is such an eventuality any more or less likely for a one-party state like China opposed to a democracy?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you, John. I think a lot depends on leadership. I mean, obviously, when it comes to matters of national war and peace, the leader of a nation, whether that leader is democratically elected or undemocratically elected, like some U.S. leaders are historically, right? Sometimes our leaders are not elected by the majority of the American public, but they are duly elected pursuant to the odd but existing terms of our Constitution, et cetera. But China, our system is what it is. China's system is very different. China's system is a self-proclaimed dictatorship. You don't have electoral accountability, no question about that. But it boils down to, does a leader take into account costs and benefits in some reasonable and rational way? I think that it is possible for democracies to act prudently, and it is possible for democracies to act irresponsibly and to warmonger. I think it is also possible for dictatorships to act prudently. And I think it is also, and with respect to whether to go to war or not, is what I'm saying. I'm not talking about the moral dimension of how they treat their people. Dictatorships are deplorable in the sense that they deprive people of basic rights and so on, and that's wrong and deplorable and something that we don't embrace or accept in this country. But what I'm talking about is when it comes to launching a war, a dictatorship can act prudently or a dictatorship can act irresponsibly. Russia is a dictatorship at this time. It has the trappings to some degree of democracy, but it is clearly a dictatorship. This dictator, Vladimir Putin, acted, in my judgment, imprudently, irresponsibly, and obviously unlawfully, immorally, and disgracefully. No question about it. Xi Jinping sits atop a dictatorship, a self-proclaimed constitutional dictatorship. That's what China calls itself. He doesn't look at the world the way that Vladimir Putin does. He doesn't act the way that Vladimir Putin does. His country is different. He's different. His history is different. His people are different. Their national interests and how they look at their national interests are different. And I think that I would go so far as to say that I don't think that just because China is in fact a dictatorship, which it is, that China has a greater proclivity to go into a war that would be bad for China than any other country. And I think we can look back in our own history and judge that we, a quote, democracy, I would argue a compromised democracy, but a democracy, self-proclaimed, that we've gone into wars that have not accorded with the will of the American people over a period of time and that have not arguably advanced our interests and so on. We can point back to history and look at those cases. China and other countries can look at their own histories. So to John's really excellent and thoughtful question, I would say, I don't think that the lack of democratic accountability, and make no mistake, there is a lack of democratic accountability. That's not in question. I don't think that the absence of democratic electoral accountability in China will push China in any particular direction. I think in the end, it is going to be a function of what the leadership of China, with Xi Jinping at its core, and as the single unitary leader of the country, what he thinks is the right thing to do. And he'll get advice from people that he gets advice from, and he'll ponder these questions, and he'll make a decision that he believes advances his interests, his party's interests, and his nation's interests. And what I will say is, I think that the one thing, in my judgment, that the Communist Party leadership is very consistent about is it will, in my opinion, tend to always do the thing that is likeliest to perpetuate the permanent monopoly on power of the Communist Party of China. Whatever that is what China will do as best the Communist Party can perceive it. And so that is the metric. A lot of times, if you look at China and you try to apply different metrics, some of the actions don't make sense. But when you bring it back to the first principle of Chinese governance, which is that the Communist Party will seek to perpetuate its permanent monopoly on power forever, then in my judgment, the decisions the Chinese leadership makes make sense, viewed through that framework, through their lens. And that will be what this hinges on. If President Xi Jinping believes that the Communist parties and his nations, and he would regard the two as inseparable, the interests of the two as inseparable, as one and the same, others would disagree, but he would regard the two as inseparable. If he believes that going into Taiwan advances the parties and the nation's interests, he will do it. If he believes that it will not, he won't. And I think he'll make that decision in a very careful way. And if I were assessing it, I would say that to the extent that the leadership of China believes that it is not in their interest to do this, I believe they are correct in that assessment. I think they would pay an extraordinary cost that they don't want to pay.
All right, we have 1 minute, so I'm going to give you a short question and then we'll be all done. What are the interests of America in Taiwan now?
What are the interests of America, the U.S. interests in Taiwan? Or
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so let me just state it the way the U.S. government would state it. And I largely agree with this assessment. You know, Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. It is a place where 24 million people live. It's a people that share the values of the American people in terms of democracy, human rights, media freedom, the right to assemble, the right to hold people who were elected accountable at the ballot box, and so forth and so on. It is the number 18 economy in the world. It is an important trading partner of the United States. It is a force for good in many respects, whether with respect to global issues like climate change or many other things. It's a critically important part of the supply chain, especially where it comes to chips and a lot of other things. You know, you don't get to be a top 20, which is to say a top 10% national economy or economy in the rank of nations or similar entities, you know, by accident. So there's a lot of value that's added there economically. And the bottom line is it's a place that matters, and it's an incredibly important partner of the United States. And the United States has an interest in making sure that nothing happens relative to Taiwan that does not accord with the will of the 24 million people in Taiwan, and making sure that Taiwan is not coerced into something it doesn't want, either by the threat of force or the use of force, so that Taiwan can continue to make the contributions to the world that it makes from its unique status. It's not a nation. It's not a country in the eyes officially of the United States. We do not have formal diplomatic relations. We, the U.S., do not recognize Taiwan as a country, but it is a place that matters dearly to the United States. These are the interests that the United States has with respect to Taiwan.
Thank you. I think there were some people in the room with Dr. Waller that didn't have a chance to ask a question. So do you mind if we extend for a couple more minutes to get those questions out?
I'm very, very happy to do that.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, let's see. I have one up here, I believe.
Hello, can you hear
Hi.
me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if President Biden was speaking to more than just the Taiwanese audience when he said that U.S. forces could be used in a defense situation, mainly addressing China's growing hegemony in the area, you know, like Japan, Vietnam, others in the region that are very concerned about their growing influence in that part of the world. And so I was wondering if he might have lumped Taiwan in with the other challenges that China is posing in the area potentially. And then the second question is, I realize they are totally different situations, but you brought up Hong Kong and what has happened there. Has China's takeover of Hong Kong made them less dynamic, less global in terms of their economy? What's been the effect of that? And is Taiwan maybe looking at that and saying, well, we don't want to go down that road? So those are the two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me address both of those. So let me continue with my truth telling as I see it and offer you my candid answer to both those questions, but in particular to the first one. I think that I personally believe that President Biden, in saying what he said on 60 Minutes and in saying what he has said at other times during his nearly 2 years as president, because this is not the first or even the second time that he said this type of thing, again, departing from declared US policy to such an extent that the White House itself had to walk it back, and the State Department, but even the White House had to walk back these comments. Now, he said these things a few times, that United States would defend Taiwan, and point blank, he said we would send troops to defend Taiwan. Who is he speaking to? He is speaking to midterm voters in this country, period. Plain and simple. There's no question about it. He's not speaking to China. He's not speaking to Taiwan. He is speaking to people who are going to vote in November and who are going to vote again in 2024. He is trying to inoculate himself and the Democratic Party from being attacked by the Republican Party as being soft or weak on China. Because when you're the sitting president of the United States and you say, we will send US troops to fight the communists over Taiwan, it then becomes impossible for Republicans to say that you are insufficiently strong on the issue of Taiwan or on the issue of China. It is pure politics, 100%. There's no question about it. And again, my opinion, but I think there's really no question. Does Joe Biden think that China is going to go into Taiwan militarily while Joe Biden is president of the United States? In my opinion, absolutely not. And therefore, he can say this at absolutely and precisely zero cost to himself, because he will never have to be the commander in chief that has to act upon his stated commitment to send troops. He knows he's never going to have to do that. He knows that if and when that ever happens, it'll happen on someone else's watch. Probably Donald Trump's or Ron DeSantis's or somebody else, not to get into politics, but it'll happen on the next person's watch, or many presidencies down the line, I would argue. Therefore, there is no cost in reality to simply saying this, but there is political upside to saying it, because now you've inoculated yourself from any charge that you could be seen as soft on China, because even Donald Trump didn't say this stuff. So that's why he did it. I don't think there can be any question. It's also the reason, in my opinion, why Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. It had nothing to do with Taiwan. Taiwan knows that America is its dear friend. Taiwan knows that America has a very strong sense of commitment to Taiwan in some broad sense. Taiwan doesn't need to be reassured of the level of commitment. If you took a vote in China, if you took a vote in the Congress of the United States, and the question for voting was, is apple pie good? You'd have 218 for and 217 against in the House of Representatives. But if you took a vote related to Taiwan, no matter what it said, it would be 435 to 0, because that's where sentiment is. So it's about inoculation against charges of being soft on China. That's what all of this stuff is. It's nothing more than that. It's not about American interests. It's not about US policy because it departs from US policy. It's about politics. And I get it. And I'm not saying it's wrong, politically, but let's understand it for what it is. Will the White House spokesman ever say what I just said? Of course not, nor the State Department spokesman. But what I said is an accurate reading. To the second question about Hong Kong, just briefly, and I will stick around. I want to be respectful of your time, but I'm happy to stay for additional questions. So don't worry about that. But with a maximum of 27 hours of straight questions, that's the limit that we have to put. With respect to the issue of Hong Kong, you're absolutely right. Taiwan looks at what has happened in Hong Kong, and it says, that's horrible. That's exactly what we don't ever want to happen ever in Taiwan. What happened in June of 2020, just over 2 years ago, China put in place something referred to as the National Security Law of Hong Kong. National Security Law. That's the name of the law. It went on the books, and it basically gutted the ability of people who live in Hong Kong residents, to peacefully protest, to express differing political views, to express differing positions on sensitive political issues. It criminalized certain types of free speech that had previously been protected in Hong Kong. Even though Hong Kong's part of China, it had special rules and greater levels of freedom, greater levels of media freedom, and so on. And the national security law undid a lot of that. So over the last couple of years, people have been thrown in jail for peacefully expressing political views, who had not ever been thrown in jail prior to June 2020, because Hong Kong allowed for the expression of those types of views. Now it doesn't to nearly the same degree. So Taiwan looks at that and says, that's one country, two systems. Are you kidding me? We would never want that. And if you're looking at it from a Taiwan perspective, or from any outside perspective, that's a reasonable position to take. China views it very differently, but yes, Taiwan looks at the Hong Kong case and says, see, we told you so. This is why we don't want anything to do with reunification. So yes, your question is right on the mark.
Great, thank you. I think we have answered all the questions. I don't think I've missed anything. So once again, Mr. Firestein, we'd like to thank you so much for speaking to us. It was a brilliant conversation we had. And Dr. Waller, if you have any last remarks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, so can I just jump in quickly? We have one last question from the Robertson room. David, would that be okay?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think, the speaker's over there, so we just,
Oh,
anyway,
just talk over here?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
No, it's okay. All right, you talk about the huge economy of China. Are you talking about mainland China and Taiwan combined?
No. I'm talking about the mainland. No, they're both really large economies by them, each separately. The mainland is number 2 in the world by itself, and Taiwan is number 18 in the world by itself.
Okay, so we could theoretically impose sanctions on China mainland businesses and have a different economic policy or sanctions or whatever to Taiwan.
That's absolutely correct. Because although we as a nation do not recognize Taiwan as a nation, and therefore we do not have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, we do effectively treat Taiwan as if it were a nation. We don't call it that, but we trade with it. We have offices there that are tantamount to embassies and consulates. They're not called that. We have a person who is tantamount to an ambassador. We don't call that individual an ambassador. But in all respects, we deal with Taiwan pretty much as if it were a country, even though we as a nation do not recognize it as a country. But for all intents and purposes, in terms of trade and so forth, the relationship between the United States and Taiwan is self-standing and is independent. It operates and functions largely independently of the relationship between the United States and China. Make no mistake, we do a lot more trade with the mainland than we do with Taiwan, because again, the scale is very different. That being said, we would, in the scenario that we discussed, the United States would seek to punish the mainland and lift up Taiwan. That would be what we would seek to do. I often say, just as a parenthetical note, this is not scientific. This is just an impressionistic assessment. If there was one place on the planet Earth today could vote itself of its own volition to become the 51st state of the United States, it would be Taiwan. I mean, it would be. I mean, literally, there is that level of sentiment and that level of connection. There is a huge bond of friendship and love and so forth between the people in Taiwan, the people in the United States. There's huge positivity in Taiwan toward the United States. There's a lot of good feelings in our country toward Taiwan, and that is not going anywhere. And that's foundational for the United States and for Taiwan, and it informs everything that we do as a nation relative to Taiwan.
Well, for example, the semiconductor businesses that we rely on.
That's right.
So are they built in Taiwan or in China? And why
Very disproportionate. They're very disproportionately built in Taiwan, but there's also a lot going on in China. But Taiwan, for a place that's smaller than Texas and has 80% of the Texas population, they are very disproportionately a major league producer of these chips. And anyone that tried to buy a new or used car in the last year or so knows how difficult it was, myself included, because there were no chips, and because of disruptions to supply chains, even around COVID-19. But Taiwan and problems in on the Taiwan side. Anyway, the bottom line is they're very central to it. China is a really important player as well. And I fervently hope that the United States and China never come to blows. I fervently hope that the mainland and Taiwan never come to blows. I fervently hope that the status quo, which basically is a status quo of peace and some level of stability, obtains for a long time to come, because it's really not in anybody's interest for that to change, because it would only change for the worse, because something could happen that could trigger a massive military conflagration. Nobody wins from that. So I support the declared U.S. policies, but all I'm doing is pointing out with objectivity, and objectivity that U.S. officials can't have, because by definition, they're bound to the U.S. talking points. What I'm saying is the reality of our policy is no longer in alignment with our declared policy. But I support the declared policy, and I've said that publicly for a long time, because it does maintain the status quo.
Thank you, David. Ryan, sorry, I cut you off there. Do you want to continue?
Sorry, Ryan got kicked out of her study room, so I'm going to fill in for her now.
Please.
But unless anybody has other questions, I think we are done here. Thank you so much for your time today. And we really appreciate you coming and speaking with us. We all enjoyed the presentation here. And thank you, all of you participants, for being here and allowing this to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just say thank you so much to everybody. Again, Marna, thank you. Chuck Gliozo, my dear friend, thank you for introducing me to Marna. I'm so grateful to you, and to all of you, John. And let me say, Ryan did a superb job as moderator, and Stella, thanks for pinch hitting at the very end. Y'all are wonderful. And if I haven't worn out my welcome, maybe sometime down the line, you'll have me again, and maybe we can even do it in person. But I'm so grateful. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
We'd be thrilled to have you back.
Thank you.
So just a quick note in closing. In 2 weeks' time, we will meet again. And I'm pretty sure the speaker, is it, yeah?
October 11th.
Oh, October the 11th. Professor Satish Utpa from the university, who is an expert on, well, many things, but including the revolution in mobility and things like driverless buses will be speaking. So again, David, thank you. Lovely to see everybody again, and hope to see you in 2 weeks. Good night.